welcome to Future Cities Africa. Today I'm excited to welcome back Bronwyn Williams, partner at Flux Trends. Bronwyn recently published 21 Trends for 2020, and one trend that stood out for me is private cities. Bronwyn, thanks for being back. What is a private city and how is it different than the cities we are used to?
So when we talk about private cities, the first thing to note is that as with most trends, it does have some context in history. And we could look back in time to the company towns that were quite a big deal, especially in the history of America. So if you talk about the sort of small town life across the American continent, particularly as that sort of continent was colonized and became the America that we know today, a lot of those small towns were really set up by companies. So firstly, they would start out being sort of mining companies. Later on, they might become big retail city towns. And essentially, the whole concept of a company town is a town that only exists because a particular company has decided to put its headquarters there. And what happened with a lot of these company towns too is that those companies would have to subsidize the community. So in fact, they kind of owned it. So in order to get workers to go move to sort of an out of the way, out in the sticks environment and sort of set up and make a life there, the company had to provide more than a job. They might have to provide other sort of amenities to attract workers to stay there. And those sort of amenities wouldn't be able to be self-sufficient, self-sustainable businesses. So if you were, say, for example, a hairdresser or a nail salon, or even a pub, if there weren't enough people, you wouldn't want to set up business there. So the companies often had to sort of sponsor that. Of course, that came with a whole lot of sort of pros and cons because the company obviously has then a lot more influence over that community than the corporate sector, or the public or the private sector should have across a more sort of democratic community, whether that's a town, a village, whatever it is. So that's just for a little bit of context. Now, this whole concept of private cities can become a lot more intensive, particularly in the modern era, the post-industrial age. We can look then across the world at what's going on in China and how China set up a lot of these massive company cities. I don't even want to call them company towns. They're essentially a company city where workers live, work, shop, learn, stay at night without actually ever leaving the company compound. And that could almost be seen as a slightly darker shade of private cities. It's almost more like indentured labor. And in fact, across the African continent, we're starting to see outposts of these exactly sort of Chinese company towns popping up, where they might send workers over to places like Namibia, or even here in South Africa, I think there are a few of them, to basically work and to sort of serve out a working sentence. You can sort of put that in inverted brackets, but that's kind of what happens. So you're only allowed to leave the company when you've paid back your debt. And once again, that's also got parallels in history where you can see what happened with colonization once again, how companies like the Dutch East India Company, for example, the British East India Company, would subsidize sort of settlers' traveling costs or their boat passage, which is how most people got to the new colonies in those sort of bad old days, depending on how you want to look at it. And those workers had to then work back their passage fare. So they were essentially sort of a kind of sanitized slave to the company until they paid back that cash. Now looking ahead, it becomes a lot more exciting because you've got Elon Musk, for example, talking about his Mars colonies he wants to put into play, where he's offering to do exactly that sort of deal, where he's offering to pay people's passage to Mars, and in exchange, they're going to have to work that back. And until you've been able to sort of work that back, you are essentially a sort of property to the company. You've got a debt that you have to repay. And when we start thinking about those sort of company private cities, particularly off-planet, if you're going to get quite dramatic into the further future, talking about Mars or even working on, say, sort of a Starlink sort of space settlement up there, on like a space station, but a privately run one. What authority are you going to defer to if you don't like the way you're being treated? What government has oversight in these new territories? And that's exactly what happened with the frontier company towns, with the sort of whole colonial model of that paying passage, paying back indentured labor. Essentially, the company was given the mandate on this new open space where there was no government to actually set up the rules for that society. You couldn't really refer to your local politician because the politician was part of the company. So there are a lot of trade-offs over there, depending on your political views as to how comfortable you'd be with this or not. On the one hand, people are saying people would only take up that deal with an Elon Musk or with the Dutch East India Company if they wanted to, so they know what they're getting into. They're making a deal. People should be able to do that. At the same time, there are obviously huge issues of potential abuse that can come out of this. And ethically, it is quite a can of worms.
What does a private city look like in the African context?
Okay, so I think I picked up on some of those examples of the sort of neo-colonialist project, the way that China's Belt and Road Initiative is working, whereby the company, which in this case also happens to be owned by the country, because it is of course a state that has a bit more influence, say in the private, so-called private or company sector than other states would have, essentially sends its own sort of workers off onto a territory. And part of those deals that China is making with African governments is that the workers working on these projects, building, and they're usually infrastructure projects, things like buildings and dams and bridges and roads and that sort of thing, don't fall under the law of the local African government. They fall under the law of the Chinese, if we want to call it once again, the sort of colonists. So they report to the company, they don't report to the country. That's part of the deal. So the country is getting great cheap infrastructure, but in exchange, they need to sort of just leave that sort of little encampment of workers alone. That's essentially the model. There's many different nuances, which probably won't get into right now, but that's how we're starting to see it now. However, in the South African context, we can also take this conversation in a different direction, once again, to what's happening with the very big, as I like to call them, new citadels that we're building. In many ways, as a futurist, I think that South Africa might be pointed towards the future of the rest of the world rather than a laggard in this space, which is something that South Africans don't often get their heads around. We seem to think that, we're always a few steps behind the rest of the world. But if you look at the trends that are progressing across places like America and parts of Europe, the more sort of, up and coming, aspirational, higher growth areas, or even look at what's going on in places like Dubai and across the Middle East, a lot of them seem to be adopting, for better or for worse, quite a lot of the South African models of organizing society. And unfortunately, that's quite an unequal way of organizing society because, as we all know, South Africans, we tend to live in gated compounds or in private citadels. We have an armed guard at the gate. We might have a few of our friends or frenemies inside that sort of gated compound with us. We'll have amenities inside that. And the trend is towards more amenities going behind private gates, essentially outside the scope of the law. So we've got massive examples here in Joburg. You've got, of course, the waterfall city sort of state development that's got corporate and retail buildings as well as residential buildings, lots of amenities. You've got the Stain City compounds coming up. And these are essentially private cities. So although they're parts of the greater community, they don't necessarily operate by the same rules. And of course, just for context, we are living in 2021. We all know about COVID lockdowns and COVID restrictions. You can look at the difference of law in front of the gate and behind the gate, and how the law is not even really allowed to get onto private property without a warrant and all those sorts of things. And when you've got larger and larger proportions of societies that are operating behind gates, essentially becoming more and more self-sufficient, because our compound model here in South Africa started out just with a few streets, putting a boom map on the gate, and saying, okay, we're going to control access to our little community. From there, it went into building full sort of residential complexes and estates that might have entertainment there. So something like a golf course or a lake or, anything like that. Even some of the new farming compounds you can see now where you can go and be a part sharecropper in like a little wine farm in KwaZulu-Natal, of all places, for example. But from there, it's become more and more self-sufficient. So we're seeing these private citadels setting up schools, setting up shops, setting up even private CBD districts within inside them, meaning that the people that live in that space don't necessarily need to go out into wider city or outside of the city gates, the citadel gates. So from my perspective, it's almost like a micronation type model that we're seeing, we're tending towards. And as I said, this is something that South Africans have sort of become accustomed to. That sort of creep or that normalization of privatizing of everyday life is something that we've had to do out of both necessity and demand, because, of course, we don't necessarily have a government that's able to provide us with the same sort of service levels that someone in an upper middle class, say, income bracket would be able to get on a more sort of socialist or welfare type basis in another part of the world. So people have kind of done that for themselves. But it's also been done out of sort of a desire of separatism, because you can put this under the sort of the more disturbing trends of our age towards things like the rise of nationalism and towards sort of divisions in society, which is perhaps a slightly less comfortable conversation. But what we're seeing now is that other parts of the world are starting to adopt this model too. So if you look at the sort of those, like the Palm Islands, sort of, the luxury estates up there in Dubai, the man-made islands on the sea, it operates on a very similar sort of level. And they don't have the excuse of saying they have to do it to prevent crime, for example. which was the South African sort of excuse for building these cities. It's more being done just out of a desire for the sort of rich to live apart and to create some sort of status level apart from the rest of society. So there's that motive. And there's also the motive towards more autonomy, because as states become more powerful and our governments are tending bigger over time, particularly at the moment, people are looking at ways to sort of reinstate some of that autonomy over their lives. And one of the ways to do that is to get away into your sort of private setups. So in that case, private cities would be more sort of residential private cities and by choice rather than company private cities, which is once again quite a different model. You know, the one is controlled by a single entity, the other one is more controlled by almost a group of sort of anarchist citizens, you can put it that way, although I'm pretty sure people that live in Waterfall Estate or Dainfern wouldn't consider themselves anarchists, but in some ways it's quite a radical thing to say I'm going to live in society but not of it. So that's another way to sort of look at how these private city models are starting to play out in the South African context.
Our cities are currently incredibly segregated and inequitable already. How do you see government getting behind the idea of private cities that can actually increase the uninclusiveness of cities? Because it sounds like private cities would benefit the few at this moment and perhaps leave the rest behind. Maybe it's a short-term problem, but it is a real problem at the moment.
Yes, well, that's absolutely one of the big points I want to make about these private cities is they're a huge double-edged sword. But as with most private solutions to what would commonly be understood to be sort of common goods problems, so when these sort of private solutions materialize and show actually this can be a market-solved problem, it's not actually a problem that requires sort of top-down control. And a lot of things that we've known as South Africans, we've been able to find a way around them. So provide your own electricity, you get a generator, provide your own water because the government's not providing water, you get a rain tank. So we're starting to see that all these things that were formerly thought or understood to only be amenities or services that were able to be provided by a central authority are now being found market solutions. That's a sort of more positive look on that, because what government wouldn't want to have less responsibility? What government wouldn't want a taxpayer that is a net taxpayer and not a net tax receiver? So there's a sort of a fiscal incentive for government to allow this to continue, an economic rationale behind saying, that's fine, provide your own schooling, provide your own electricity, provide your own security. That means we've got more budget to apply to those who need it more. Because of course, these people that live in private cities might be providing their own services, but they're not paying tax, at least at the moment, until sort of Bitcoin and crypto maybe become a bit of a challenge there, but that's an aside, so we can park that thought. So for now, from an economic perspective, it actually benefits a government, and particularly a weak state government, such as what we've got in South Africa, where the government is overextended and already has a small tax base and a lot of needy people they need to support. However, there's a bigger problem that comes from this, because it does tend to perpetuate inequality. Because when we look at sort of city design and how cities become healthy and become useful for everyone in the community, you need to have that diversity. You need to have people of all different socioeconomic strata bumping into each other, because that's how people are able to have mobility through society. That's how people who are starting off from a less fortunate position are able to make connections with people in more fortunate situations and to sort of work their way up the sort of socio-economic ladder. And you're essentially taking that opportunity away from them when we basically, and it's a horrible thing to say, but it's exactly what we're doing. We're reinstating the whole sort of passbook system that we had during apartheid, right? So you can't come into my suburb unless you've got a pass card, like literally a sticker on your car or an electronic tag. And that's a horrible thing for South Africans who live within these sort of luxury private cities to grapple with. But I think it is a comment that's worth making, because in practical sense, we're doing the same thing. We're creating spatial apartheid and we're enforcing it with very strict border control in the forms of gates, which means that not only are we separating rich and poor, so we're not building social ties that help make a more stronger society and to build sort of trust and respect and kindness and just deal with those sort of socioeconomic divisions on a very social level. We're also literally preventing those people from creating economic ties that could help them to pull themselves up out of the cycles of poverty. So segregating people into rich and poor is not particularly good for innovation, for growth, for social stability and all those sorts of things. And we know that economic divisions, we know that inequalities are one of the most concerning things of our point of time in history, because that is the sort of question that tears societies apart. And particularly now, not necessarily because inequality is much higher today than it has been throughout the general course of human history, but more because we are able to see now exactly how the other half lives. We are able to see how millionaires in Hollywood, spend their luxury lockdown hours. We are able to see through our computer screens on Instagram how the middle class is living. So there's no way to sort of hide luxury and excess from people that are having to do without, which means that there's more resentment about inequality than there has been in the past, because people know what they are being denied. And inequality is, of course, something that governments have to be very, very careful about. So governments have to weigh up the challenge of trying to, enjoy the benefits, the physical benefits, like I explained, of being able to not actually have to spend more money on people who don't actually need that money to be spent, and at the same time trying to control social divisions that could turn into violent unrest. I mean, these sort of divisions are the divisions that lead to things like crime, that lead to things like revolutions, worst case scenario. So I do expect the governments are going to start cracking down on these things, but it's almost like a luxury policy. So in very, very economically constrained times like we have right now in COVID, when they're trying to scrape together money to find just money for a vaccine or to bail out an airline, whatever governments need to find money to do, they might be prepared to turn a blind eye from these trends. But looking ahead, as those citadels start to become more powerful and to sort of, extract a lot more of the wealth from society, and as those inequalities grow, they're going to have to reassess what's going on here. On a very sort of dramatic level of this, we've got the sort of rumors of successions, things like the Western Cape wanting to sort of secede from the rest of South Africa. That for me would be the sort of the end point sort of final scenario of like how we can sort of trend towards this more and more sort of fracturing of society into different, more homogenous groups, which is very, very sad for things like innovation and inspiration. And then just one more point there in terms of how governments are looking at this, that I've spoken there from more sort of like the South African developing market reality and context, because that's the context I live in and quite close to understanding the dynamics of that system. But we can also look at what governments are doing in more developed parts of the world, because it's always sort of useful to look at those two polar opposites. And the sort of private cities that are being developed there are much more sort of private, smart, very high-tech cities, where governments have been in talks with private companies to literally build very, very smart cities, to build sort of high-tech cities and have those cities essentially run by the tech company. So you had, of course, the whole Cyborgs Labs thing in Canada, which the government was very, very keen on. The government was very keen on getting Google to come and develop a private city there. But activists and citizens were less excited about that because, of course, you've got a different dynamic in the society there where privacy is a luxury that people can afford, which might not be something that people could afford in a more sort of developing part of the world. And there was quite a big backlash from that. So these sort of projects have been put on hold in those sorts of places, not because the governments don't want them, but because the people are saying, we don't feel comfortable with this. And they've got good reasons for saying so. Because in those sort of very high-tech, very connected, very surveilled, we have to actually use those sort of words when these companies or cities or counties are being built by tech companies. They're being built with surveillance and data collection in mind, because that's the incentive for the company to build that smart city so they can collect that data and turn it into a raw material for their profit or their business model, which is quite interesting. So it's a self-sustaining model again, makes sense from a sort of governance perspective, very efficient. But again, it's a challenge for citizens living there when it comes to things like democracy. Because essentially, if you're a citizen in a smart surveilled city run by a company, you're no longer actually a democratic citizen that can sort of determine your destiny by voting or participating in a democratic process. You're not ruled by policy. You're essentially ruled by either a protocol or by a set of terms and conditions. So you can imagine that you sort of sign in terms and conditions to go live in your city rather than electing a governor, which is quite an interesting model, but it is something that cities and countries are exploring. In fact, it's not just a very sort of Silicon Valley, very West Coast, very American thing. That one of the world's first smart private cities was actually in India, a county called Lavasa, I think it's called, if I'm getting my pronunciation right, which is quite interesting to look at. And it was set up as a smart, privately run city. And it is coming into conflict with the wider community because you've essentially got this sort of self-governed city. And this is like a fully functional city, not just a sort of factory and then the workers that work for it, but it's like a private, sort of almost an experiment they've set up there to do that. It's very, very interesting to see how these ideas start to clash with our concepts of democracy and get us to re-question what it is that we really want. Because that's, of course, the other question. As someone living in South Africa would know, perhaps the democratic solution isn't the solution that suits all individuals equally. And that's probably quite a controversial statement, but I'm not making a case against democracy. I'm just saying that there are incentives in place for certain people to say, I would prefer to have a more efficient place to live. I would prefer to have an efficient, cost-effective society to live in where I get all the amenities that I need. And in exchange, I'm prepared to trade away some of my democratic rights and some of my rights to things like privacy. And we've got great parallels there to what's going on with sort of social media apps at the moment and free messaging apps. There's a trade-off there. And for some people, the costs of privacy and the costs of sort of autonomy over what we're allowed to say, how we're allowed to play in those spaces is greater than the benefits of the low cost, really efficient convenience that allows these apps and platforms and smart cities allow us to have. For other people, the values of that equation don't add up. For other people, they would rather have the efficiencies, would rather trade away their privacy and perhaps even some of their democratic rights in exchange for getting, easy access to services and amenities. Very complicated questions, lots of incentives to play, and where you sort of align on that process will depend on your values and also on your socioeconomic status. These trade deals look very attractive to someone who is struggling. So very, very interesting there.
How can these private cities go horribly wrong in Africa?
Well, I think as we mentioned previously, I think the inequality issue can go horribly, horribly wrong. In fact, there's quite a popular science fiction writer, Octavia Butler. She wrote a series called The Parable of the Sower, which I would recommend to your readers if you're interested in science fiction and futures, you have a look at. And she's been lauded as being hugely prescient when it comes to what's gone on over the last 2 years. In fact, the second book in that series even had a president that promised to make America great again. And she wrote these in the 90s. So we should probably look at what she's got going on there. And what she wrote about there is essentially an America that has turned into a variant of South Africa. And why I enjoyed reading that is because when I was reading her vision of a dystopian USA, she was essentially describing the Johannesburg that I've grown up in for the last 30 years, talking about gated communities with armed guards that are trying to keep the poor out and to sort of separate. And what she sort of wrote about is how those systems devolve. So as more and more people are outside the gates and less people are inside the gates and more division there is, the more risk of those sort of gated communities, which are essentially sort of downgraded modern versions of a sort of a castle city that we used to have in medieval times, sort of run by a feudal lord. The more risk there is of those sort of hordes outside the gate, and it's a horrible word to use, but all the people, the disenfranchised, will want to come and attack those citadels. And she speaks about how those citadels entirely break down. Those gated communities first sort of fragment and then they stagnate, and then people get poorer and poorer inside of them. And they end up those societies end up sort of destroying itself. So it turns into a complete dystopia, driven very much by inequality and by the fact that people are motivated by sort of economic constraints only, not thinking about the social dynamics. And that's something that, as someone like myself, who does tend to have sort of more free market libertarian tendencies, I'm not exactly fully in that camp, but I do tend to sort of skew towards more freedom and less control. It's something that I've had to really think about as an individual, because actually, if you want to get maximum returns to personal freedom, you have to make sure that your social contract is strong enough that people are prepared in exchange to negotiate that freedom for yourself. And this is why we have things like taxes in place. The tax is essentially you paying protection money. So you're sort of taking a bit from the rich to give to the poor so that people all sort of tend to get along. And that's a sort of a very simplified way to think about why we pay tax. We pay taxes to look after our welfare and our warfare. And warfare is really just a nice alliterative way to sort of talk about the law and order side of what a state provides. And as sort of more and more of society fragments into these sort of more private cities, the risk going ahead is that social contract breaks down. Because if you take a very, very successful citadel that has built itself up, has now got all the amenities it needs, what if the residents of one of those sort of private enclaves decide to go on a tax strike? And I think I alluded to that a little bit earlier. What if they say, actually, we're not going to pay protection money to the state because we've developed our own sort of private army. We've got our own private defense force, our own armed guards. They work with us, they live with us. We actually want to separate. Then suddenly your sort of social contract breakdown just accelerates, because those advantages that I spoke about earlier of governments being able to sort of get the tax money from the wealthy, but without having to spend more of that money back into the wealthy communities, breaks down. I think that's a very, very real risk, especially as we start to see that governments are starting to realize the challenge to the welfare, warfare, social contract that comes from things like cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrencies essentially offer a tax haven, not just to the really rich, but also to the middle class, essentially to anyone that isn't earning an income from a payroll. Because if you're earning income from a payroll, as we know, the government gets the money before you get the money. So there's no way to avoid paying that tax if you're on a payroll. So if you're sort of working class, and let's be honest, sort of even white collar workers that are working for a salary are working class in this sort of model. However, anyone that operates as a freelancer would be able to sort of trade within a virtual private city. And a virtual private city is a concept that as a futurist I'm more sort of interested in, but even just the terrestrial ones, as interesting as those dynamics are, is that the virtual private city is when you start to build an economy where money doesn't have to exit a cryptocurrency type system. In other words, where I'm not only earning cryptocurrency, I'm also able to pay for goods and services within everything that I need within that ecosystem, because governments can obviously only tax on ramps and off ramps in these sorts of private currencies. So for me, I think the idea of a private currency and private cities go very close together and becomes a systemic risk for society when you've got a way for people to enjoy the benefits of social funds without contributing to them. And I think we're going to have to think very, very carefully about virtual private cities and how we're able to link that back to terrestrial needs. Because at the end of the day, as amazing it is to be able to earn your own money in your own sort of virtual enclave and never have to, interact with the world, be in the world, but not of the world. How fantastic is that? The reality is we are warm-blooded human beings. We haven't been uploaded to computer chips yet. And that means that we live in society with other real human beings, and we compete for real resources. We compete for space, we compete for land, we compete for water, we compete with violence with each other. And when that social contract breaks down, when you're no longer essentially paying your protection money, you're no longer sort of paying for the rights to be privileged, how are we able to maintain social stability? And that's where the Octavia Butler idea of this sort of breakdown of the citadel becomes very, very interesting, because she's essentially talking about a breakdown of the social contract into a very dystopian future. I'm sure we're not headed exactly there, but I think it's always good to look at these sort of dramatic science fiction novels to see the sort of logical conclusion of the paths we're on if we don't think very, very carefully about what we're breaking as we're making.
Over the next 5 years, what do you think would go extinct in cities?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what would go extinct, but I do think that certain cities themselves are going to go extinct. So what we have definitely seen over the last sort of 12 to 18 months is an acceleration of a reversal. So sort of reverse urbanization, essentially, and really just directly to the conversation we're having right now, where we're seeing wealthy people migrating outside of cities and going to live in suburban locations. And, we've seen the Silicon Valley exodus. That's been a big sort of trend on Clubhouse and everything, where all the very, very rich sort of tech startups are like wanting to move to Miami now because they're all doing it at the same time, because they all have the same idea at the same time. That's the way sort of mimetic society tends to work. That's sort of one example, but we are definitely seeing, you can see in the property prices across even South Africa too, people that have realized that if remote work can work, why do they have to live in a small sort of Sandton apartment when they have a nice big house in, say, Betty's Bay, for example, in the Cape? So there's a real incentive there. But the danger is, of course, that once again, then we are increasing the separation of society. So we're ending up with wealthier people forming new sort of enclaves. If they aren't private cities yet, but just sort of like areas where wealthy people live, and our cities become places where less wealthy people are. And dynamic, diverse, successful, happy, healthy cities do require a mix of people across the socioeconomic structure. And so that's why there's this sort of two trends in play. The shorter term trend over the next couple of years is going to be this sort of reverse urbanization of the wealthy. Now, in South Africa, it's more complicated because we still have a larger trend of people moving towards cities. And I think our sort of African Union passports are only going to accelerate that pro-urban trend. But it's a two different streams. So you've got the poorer people heading towards cities and richer people heading out of cities, which is not a healthy sort of trend in that regard. However, looking a bit further ahead, we're going to see the revival of cities. I do believe this quite strongly for a couple of reasons. One is because of top-down regulation and planning that's happening, particularly I'm talking here about sort of developed parts of the world, but I can also apply this to Cape Town, which is following a lot of the sort of more first world policies in terms of city planning. As city planners look at developing what they're calling those sort of 5 minutes or 15-minute cities, where you've got everything within a 15-minute walking radius, it becomes a walking city. And walking cities do tend to be sort of healthier cities. They're more attractive places to live. And you look like Paris greening itself and all the rest of it. So there's essentially almost like a sort of blurring between what the city of the future is going to be like and what a suburb of the future is going to be like. And if the city is green and pedestrian friendly, it becomes as attractive to a young family to go and work and live there as the suburbs would have been. In fact, it becomes more attractive because cities offer people more amenities, more entertainment, more opportunities for connection and growth. So that's the one reason why I don't think the reverse urbanization trend is necessarily going to be the only trend in play, why I don't think cities are lost yet. The other one is because of innovation itself. So cities do create more patents, they create more businesses because proximity, real proximity, not just virtual proximity through the screen, is very, very conducive towards innovation. There's reasons for this. There's no room for serendipity in a virtual connections. Virtual connections and remote work are essentially, once again, a virtual city space, because I'm sure you've seen over the last year, what happens with sort of more virtual connections with colleagues, with suppliers, is that those sort of communications networks don't grow, they become more consolidated because you're not randomly running into other people. And there's many examples for that. So if I was doing this interview with you in your office, I would have spoken to your receptionist, I would have bumped into your colleagues, I might have had a cup of coffee with someone else who happened to be in the office. And that's how serendipitous ties are made, and that's how sort of connections grow. This is the strength of networks. This is how we get innovation. So unless we're able to find ways to create serendipity in our online lives, and we're cutting off so many of those branches, so many of those opportunities to meet strangers that we wouldn't meet in the day-to-day course of our lives, innovation will decline. And that will once again pull a pendulum swing back towards cities to say, okay, no, we want that sort of inspiration. We understand that's where growth comes from, growth, dynamism, all the rest of it. And then just, of course, the fact that people get lonely. And I think that sort of real human physical connections in the post-COVID world become quite a luxury purchase. But that's a longer term trend. And then looking even further ahead, we're going to be able to solve those serendipity issues. So we're going to see, once again, more arbitrage towards out of cities again. So if the micro trend is wealthy leave cities, the sort of midterm trend is cities like reform in certain ways. And the even longer trend is that it becomes more and more accessible to start creating those serendipitous occasions through things like virtual reality, socializing type platforms, or even through just the evolution of social media from screen-based, which is very closed off, towards more audio and more sort of Ethernet type connections, which makes it more natural ways to connect. And that's going to be facilitated by the likes of, the satellites, internet networks that we put up into the sky is essentially going to connect the whole world. So it's not like a case of not being able to get fast internet in a remote location. You're going to be able to work efficiently from essentially anywhere. So we're going to see those sort of that pull push back to and from cities. But if I was looking towards what I would be doing, I wouldn't be rushing too quickly to run away from a city right now. I think there's a lot of benefits if you are looking for growth, if you're looking to still make money. There's a lot to be said for being in close proximity with real people that you can run into accidentally.
So Bronwyn reads on average one book every 2 days, and that was in 2020. From all the books you've read, is there one that stand out that can help us prepare for what may lie ahead over the next 5 years?
Okay, well, I would go back to quite an older book that I read quite recently. That would be Jane Jacobs' The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And I think it's a great book for people that are watching this particular show, that are interested in cities and dynamics and complexity, to have a look at, because it talks a lot about the various benefits, the pros and cons of centralization and decentralization. And the most important thing that I took away from that book that is relevant to the conversation we had today is that when we're designing cities, that in fact you can roll the same observation out to societies at large. When we start building borders between communities, that's when we start to get rot. That's when we start to develop things like slums, and we start to get urban degradation rather than rejuvenation. We should rather be thinking about how we can build seams, so places for bordering communities to integrate with each other. So it's quite a lovely metaphor, right? So have like a seam on clothes. You've got the cotton that goes up and down, and there are ways for flow to go between those borders, almost like a cell, rather than like a biological cell, rather than like a physical concrete cell. There's literally a wall between communities. We've got to think about that. It would be a challenge to people, both like myself, who do tend to like things like autonomy, and for people that perhaps don't have those views. There is a lot of incentive from both a commercial and economic and a societal and a political perspective to want more seams between our communities and less straight borders, because diversity is key on all sorts of levels. And I'm talking like deep diversity, not sort of box ticking and making sure people have all the right sort of color, shade, sex, and gender are in the right place, but deep diversity and the ability to run into people, to bump into people that you wouldn't, that aren't necessarily part of your core socioeconomic demographic, are so key to growth, development, progress, and just general human flourishing. So I definitely recommend that book. A lot of interesting questions around the limits of central control over society, but at the same time, the huge benefits of literally a centralization of people, like getting people into proximity with each other.